Hello again, everybody out there. We have with us once again Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Financial. And the big questions now for Mark, a very well-studied economist, is what's ahead with the economy considering what is going on with the Fed's announcements today that interest rates are going to be raised, probably a series of raises, following the news that also depressed the market that stocks fell when there were fears that Russia might invade Ukraine. So both those factors are at play now. So Mark, what do you think? First of all, the announcement that interest rates are going to rise, what effect is that going to have?
That's probably going to have a very huge effect on the economy, especially tech stocks. Tech stocks and technology stocks just really don't like higher interest rates. And it will have a slowing effect on the economy. I think what caught everybody by surprise earlier today, the S&P was up almost 86 points and then lost the entire 86 and actually was at one point was down 40 points. And that was because during Jerome Powell's conference call, he pretty much dropped the hint that we're going to see substantial interest rate hikes this year. Wall Street's kind of predicting about 4 this year, but when you say substantial and you're already predicting 4, what does that really mean?
Wow. So, and it's starting in March, right?
Starting in March, they're going to raise interest rates. That's the hint that Jerome's dropping, as well as they're going to stop the quantitative easing program, where the government goes in and buys mortgage-backed securities to help lower interest rates on mortgages. So the QE program ending and higher interest rates, that's going to have a major effect on mortgage interest rates, which you should see a slowdown in the housing market sometime in the second half of the year.
Well, Mark, now they're raising interest rates to tamp down inflation, correct? Which is now at 7%.
Correct. It's kind of they kind of have two objectives. One is to slow the economy to get inflation under control, and the second part is the Federal Reserve needs to reload its guns because there will be a recession somewhere down the road, and they just want those extra bullets in there to shoot at the next recession. Okay,
so by raising interest rates to tamp down inflation, keep it from going any higher, at the same time they are slowing down the economy, and doesn't that just compound the problems with any kind of economic recovery anytime soon?
Correct. Right now, the economy is kind of muted. Unemployment numbers are low, but they're low because so many people have dropped out of the labor force. And then you look at other things like the economic data, like ISM, the IHS reports. Those numbers are coming in declining. And then just here in the last few days, J.P. Morgan was forecasting a 7% growth in GDP this year. They've already cut that number down to 1.5%, and the Fed hadn't even made their first rate increase.
Well, my next question would be is there any way that Biden can fix this before the crucial midterm elections?
I really don't see a way. On the inflation front, the bulk of the inflation is actually coming from higher gasoline prices and oil prices. If he was to go in there and allow more drilling, because he's been very aggressive on stopping drilling programs, pipelines and such, that would take a huge hit into the inflation picture from lowering that. And then the second thing is the supply issues. There's all these huge cargo ships off the coast of California that are just sitting there. They're just struggling to unload them. The president does have the power to sign an executive order and order those cargo ships to go to Houston, Florida, wherever, and unload their cargo, but he's not doing that.
So you don't think he's going to make any of these moves that would have a bounce back for the economy before the midterm elections, which, don't look good for him and his party unless the economy does improve. So therefore, it doesn't look like Biden is going to have good prospects for the midterms.
That's correct. A lot of, in my personal opinion, I think so many people are probably, Biden's really not running the show. The Democrats, I think, are so focused on trying to push through their agendas and their objectives. They really don't care about inflation. They really don't care about economic growth. They don't care about the cargo problems. They just want to get their bills passed, because we all know once you pass a liberal welfare program, it's here forever.
Well, getting back to the Ukrainian situation, if Russia does invade, won't that drive up defense contract stocks? And wouldn't that have a ripple effect for the entire economy? It'd be good for the economy.
Well, it'd be good for defense stocks. I don't know if it'd necessarily be good for the economy, simply because what you'd have if you start, if you and it really depends on how big, how big are you going to go on this? Are you going to put sanctions on Russia? Because if you put sanctions on Russia, I can tell you right now, Russia is going to dramatically reduce their oil supply to countries, which is going to drive oil prices and gasoline prices up abroad as well as here at home. That's going to have an impact on the economy. Does the threat of a nuclear war get involved in this? The Ukraine is technically Russia. I don't think we have any reason to tell Russia to go and not take a country that technically belongs to them to begin with. Very similar to World War I, when Germany got split into two pieces, and a big chunk of Germany got put to Czechoslovakia. And when World War II came around, Hitler said, "Hey, that part of Czechoslovakia belongs to Germany. It's German people that got taken away during World War I. I'm going to take it back." Same situation here.
Well, the way I see it is that Putin's main concern, which is getting very little emphasis in mainstream American media, his main concern is not to have Ukraine become a NATO member, because he says that is an existential threat to Russia, since missiles being placed there near the border with Russia, it's a 5 to 7 minute missile flight to Moscow, and therefore he can't have that. Does that sound legitimate to you?
It sounds very legitimate. Also, it's the same thing in the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
We didn't want Russia putting missiles in Cuba. If it's good enough for us, why isn't it good enough for the Russians to say, "Hey, we don't want U.S. military missiles sitting that close to Moscow"?
I'm wondering if the way all this is going to work out behind the scenes is, despite what they're saying publicly, Biden is going to assure Putin that Ukraine will not be joining NATO. Therefore, Putin will withdraw, and then Biden can brag that he backed down Putin. Do you see that playing out, that scenario?
That could work out too. Right now with the Biden administration, they're grasping for any straw they can to put a positive spin on. So yes, that's a very viable solution though.
Of course, the real danger here is, the Dr. Strangelove scenario, where you'd have somebody going off the deep end, or just through miscalculation or incompetence, it could blow up into a huge regional war and perhaps even go nuclear. That too is a possibility, is it not, as dire as it is?
That's always a fear. But right, to be honest, Biden's a very weak commander. If Russia goes into Ukraine, I really don't see them going much beyond just doing the sanctions, and the sanctions will actually hurt us more than it'll hurt Russia.
Here's another thing that's looming on the horizon. Will this encourage China to finally invade Taiwan? So we have a situation on both fronts there.
If I was a Chinese general and Russia invades the Ukraine, I'd definitely go after Taiwan on that.
And if they invade Taiwan, doesn't that endanger our economy even more, because they're a major chip supplier for us, are they not?
That is correct. We would take a major, and we already have a major semiconductor shortage now, and Taiwan is a major semiconductor producer. That's correct. If China was to take Taiwan, if you're having problems finding iPhones and laptops now, or buying cars because of the semiconductor shortage, it will get a whole lot worse.
Wouldn't that be against China's best interest, though, since they ship so much of their stuff to us? A lot of their economy is based on us buying their products.
That's correct. Their economy is totally based on that. But in the standpoint that China actually has such a large military, they could technically take Taiwan, and Taiwan would just surrender. Taiwan just really doesn't need to get into a knockdown drag out with China. So,
in other words, they're in the driver's seat. They could take Taiwan. We don't do anything about it, and we're still dependent on their goods that we have to keep buying, because we outsourced all the manufacturing to China.
Correct. We'll be even more dependent on them, more for semiconductors, more for technology, and so forth. Yeah, we're stuck in a really, really bad spot.
Do you see this stemming back to the situation with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the way Biden withdrew, and that this caused the perception that we had a weak, incompetent commander-in-chief, and therefore it encouraged both Russia and China?
The Afghan withdrawal was probably one of the worst things, and this is it. There's a military base in northern Afghanistan. It is like the most high-tech, super reinforced military base that the U.S. military has ever built, and they built that with the sole purpose that that military base could put stealth bombers on it, and they could hit China from the back door all day long, and China wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. That base is so important, the Chinese government has already offered to buy that military base from Afghanistan, and it's just a complete disaster. If that military base was still there under U.S. control, I don't think you would hear China wanting to invade Taiwan, because that military base in Afghanistan, when I say we had China by the throat, we really had China by the throat with being there.
You're talking about Bagram.
Correct.
Was there any logic to giving up Bagram and having that kind of withdrawal? I mean, was there any kind of military logic for it being done that way?
None that I can see. I really think it comes down to, because according to what the generals have been saying, that how Biden ordered the withdrawal to occur and what the generals are saying, the generals are saying that's not how we told them to do it. So they're trying to throw Biden under the bus, and that could be true, because Biden really just does not have a firm grasp on reality right now.
Well, I mean, was it really his decision, or was it the people around him who persuaded him to do it, or just took control? Because we don't know really, if he's actually allowed to make decisions. I mean, if it was the people around him, were they that naive? Were they that doctrinaire about the way they see the world? I mean, what would account for that kind of a disastrous withdrawal?
It could. I think it's probably outside influence, because based on what I know about that military base, I don't know how any military commander would ever allow that base to be lost. That just, if a general acknowledged the loss of that base, that they did it, they need to be stripped of their rank and fired, because I just cannot exaggerate enough how bad of a decision it was to lose the world's best position and strongest military base in the world without a fight.
All right, let's assume that Russia does not invade Ukraine and China does not take over Taiwan. Will the economy be in a better position to recover then?
The economy's the economy's been in bad shape for ever since 2008. It's never really been able to get a good firm footing. If you look back, used to, the Fed would cut interest rates, and that kind of fixed the problem. And, they'd cut 100 basis points, but they'd have to raise 200 basis points to slow the economy down, because the economy is so strong. Now you're seeing the reverse. They have to basically, they raise interest rates, 2 or 3 times, and the economy starts to slow dramatically, and then they have to turn around and they have to start cutting 5 or 6 times to jumpstart. That worked for a while. Then they had to start doing the TARP program of bailing out, banks to save the economy. That worked for a while. Then they had to start doing the QE programs. That worked for a while. Then they started this COVID stuff. So every time we get into an economic situation, they have to pull the old tricks out of the bag and come up with a new trick. And my concern is, when does the bag run out of tricks?
Well, so let's assume if Russia does invade Ukraine, if China does take over Taiwan, we're in real deep trouble. But if they don't invade Ukraine or Taiwan, we're still in pretty bad trouble, correct?
We're still in pretty bad trouble, because the U.S. has so much debt on its books that a very small interest rate increase can have dramatic impacts on interest payments. Give you an example. For the U.S. government, we pay about $400 billion a year in interest payments on our debt. If the Fed starts going out and raises 100 basis points, we're looking at probably about $600 billion a year in interest payments.
Well, before all this occurred, you've been predicting in previous months that we're overdue, I guess, for a market correction anyway. So it would have occurred even without these developments, correct?
Correct. You've heard me talk about the 7-year cycle. Every 7 years, the stock market runs into a major roadblock and goes down. This year is a 7-year cycle. What kind of makes this 7-year cycle different from other 7-year cycles is this year the Federal Reserve is also raising interest rates in the 7-year cycle, which I think is just going to add more pressure to the downside.
All right. So considering all these factors, What is your projection for the economy in the next 6 months or so? Are we headed towards a disaster or just a deep correction or a recession or a depression? What's the story?
I think you'll see a fairly deep correction. No Federal Reserve governor wants to be remembered for collapsing the U.S. economy. Ben Bernanke basically is remembered for the housing bubble. Roy Young was the Federal Reserve governor in 1929. He gets blamed for the Great Depression. So all your Fed governors want to kick the can down the road, and no one wants to take the blame for it. So the way I see it, the Fed will start raising interest rates. At some point, it will scare the market enough that the Fed will have to make a hard stop and say, no, no, no more Fed increases. And then the stock market will stabilize and start to rally up.
But that stabilization will be much more difficult to achieve if Ukraine is invaded by Russia and if China takes over Taiwan, correct?
Well, if there's, based on the history of the Federal Reserve, if there is a global incursion, like, invading Taiwan or Ukraine or something like that, the Federal Reserve historically has stepped back from any kind of quantitative tightening or raising interest rates to help the economy grow during those conflicts.
So therefore, worst case scenario, if Ukraine is invaded by Russia, if China takes over Taiwan, worst case scenario for the economy in the next 6 months or so is what?
Worst case scenario is you just see an actual recession, but I don't think that's going to occur. I don't see the indicators for a recession at this point. But after Jeremy Powell said substantial rate increases, you start increasing about 100 to 125 basis points. Now you start getting into recession territory. But you start saying substantial, are you going to push it above that 125? Sounds like it.
All right, Mark, last question. Considering all of this, you're the financial expert. You advise people what to invest in all the time, and you're quite successful. So what would be your advice for investors at a time like this? What should they invest in? What should they dump? What should they buy? What?
Well, when interest rates go up, you don't want to be in technology stocks. Technology stocks tend to do the worst in a rising interest rate environment. So you want to dramatically reduce your technology stock holdings. But the places that usually thrive in these kind of environments are going to be stuff like, rising interest rates are good for banks. They're good for brokerage firms. Based on all the inflation that we're having, especially if the Ukraine gets invaded and we see a reduction in Russian oil supply, energy stocks could benefit a lot. And then, of course, you go with your old tried and true consumer staple stocks. No matter how bad the economy gets, recessions, wars, people still have to eat. So consumer staple stocks are a great place to be at.
And how about, like toiletries and all that? You still need toilet paper. You still need paper towels, things like that, correct?
Correct. You still need the underarm deodorant. You still need the toothpaste. You still need to take your medicines. If you're taking, Lipitor or whatever, you still need to go back. So your pharmaceuticals are going to be a strong place. Again, consumer staples, discount stores where you can buy stuff cheaper. Those companies thrive in rising inflationary environments.
Although the dollar stores are now the $1.25 stores, right?
That's correct. There is a joke that the $1.25 is now called the $1.25 store.
All right, Mark Collinsworth of Vere Global Financial. Thanks once again for your projections about what kind of an economic mess we're in right now and where we are headed. Mark, thanks a lot.
Thank you.